And former Trump chairman Paul Manafort is now at home serving the rest of his prison sentence from his house. He was released earlier after his lawyer cited coronavirus concerns, but that is not an option for every inmate, and activists warn prisons could become incubators for the virus. NBC News' correspondent Trymaine Lee joins me now from Sullivan County, New York. Trymaine, one Sullivan County jail was placed on lockdown earlier this week because of a coronavirus scare there. Can you tell us what happened?
That's right, Gotti. As coronavirus continues to spread across the country and prisons and jails become hotspots, there are a number of them who have so far avoided the nightmare scenario that we've seen time and again. Sullivan County Jail just got its first confirmed case of COVID-19 in the inmate population this week. Now, in recent weeks, they've had 4 staff members also test positive, but we're only about 2.5 hours away from New York City, and the New York City jail system has been ravaged like so many others across the country. So this jail is bracing, hopefully, to guard against the coronavirus. But once the virus, COVID-19, gets into these prison walls, it's really bad. It ravages them completely, Gotti.
Yeah, and it seems like it's not just there. It seems like these days the biggest hotspots are always meatpacking facilities, nursing homes, and prisons. What's going on around the rest of the country?
Oh, that's the truth. You know, prisons and jails have become the hottest of the hotspots when it comes to COVID-19. Now, let's keep in mind just the vastness of the American prison system. There are over 2.3 million people currently incarcerated in the jails and also prisons. And so far, 70% of federal inmates who've been tested have come up positive for COVID-19. Now, when you take account of the city and state prison systems, you're talking about another nearly 10,000 inmates. Now, I've been getting DMs and emails from inmates and their families, also some video diaries from folks, and they, quite frankly, feel like they've been left to die. And so you have to imagine that the vast majority of people in the prison system are there for nonviolent offenses. And so in so many ways, they're trapped behind walls. They're many times in congregate housing. There's no possible way to socially distance yourself from anyone else, and it feels like a death sentence, Gotti.
Hey, going back to Paul Manafort's release, we were under the impression that he technically wasn't eligible for early release because he had not yet served half of his sentence. So how does the Justice Department decide who gets in and who doesn't, and who's able to be released?
Gotti, that's a great question. As you know, there are people mobilizing and organizers and activists all across the country advocating on behalf of your everyday inmate. Now, Paul Manafort has gotten out. He didn't necessarily fit the bill. AG Barr, Attorney General Bill Barr, ordered the Bureau of Prisons to look at a way to release some prisoners who were either, very vulnerable in terms of their age or their health, or also those who are serving time in facilities that have been highly impacted. Now, while no one at the Pennsylvania prison where Paul Manafort was being held got COVID-19, he did get sick in January and February with the flu. But that is the big question. While there are so many, especially nonviolent offenders out there, very vulnerable all across the country, many of them are pushing and struggling to get out. But Paul Manafort, a good friend of the president and the administration, gets out early, has a lot of people scratching their heads, Gotti.
Wow. And here in L.A., the county released something like 5,000 people before things really started getting bad. We've seen in Chicago, rapper and activist Common is pushing for more inmate releases. He's got a push right now called We Matter Too. Let's play a little bit of his video.
If it comes in here, it's going to spread like wildfire because
everything's confined. You have 4-man cells, 6-man cells.
Our bunks are on top of each other. The cells are very small. The showers, they either get cleaned once a day or sometimes they don't get cleaned at all.
Everybody's still playing cards. The phones are like not even 2 feet from each other, so it's not like everybody's really separated.
They don't supply us with no gloves or anything. As of antibacterial soap and stuff like that, there's none of that available.
Trymaine, can you tell us a little bit more about this campaign? Do you think this is going to work?
I mean, part of the mission for this campaign is to illustrate the very dire circumstances that so many folks find themselves in behind bars. Now, to a lot of people, you've been incarcerated, you've been convicted, you're a throwaway. But these are people's nephews, their sons, their spouses. And so the effort of Common and so many other people around the country who are pushing is to say, let's not forget that they are humans and that we matter too came from a sign from an inmate at Cook County's jail who held the sign and said, we matter to. So the effort here is to try to organize high-profile individuals, people with some sort of power and celebrity, to put pressure on their local policymakers and on the administration. Let's not forget how Kim Kardashian West has been able to, get the ear of the White House and actually made some things happen. So the effort here is to really put pressure on the policymakers who may be able to take some action before it's too late, because right now it's pretty bad across the country, Gotti.
So important to remember. Thanks so much, Trymaine.
Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.